Morning, everybody. So I'll get started. There's a few people coming in late. Yeah, come in, sit down. There's lots of space. So my name is Dave Neary. Some of you might know me from Migo and Mimo. And I'm going to give you a presentation about community anti-patterns today. So I guess the first thing to say, like Ronan before me, is to explain what a community anti-pattern is. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the 60s, or perhaps even the 50s. And a guy called Christopher Alexander wrote a book called A Pattern Language. He was an architect. He wrote a book about how buildings, towns, villages were constructed. And his goal was to give architects a vocabulary that they could use when they were talking to people about design decisions in architecture. So his goal was not to create patterns. It was to codify existing behavior. And of course, we all know design patterns from the Gang of Four. Object-oriented, elements of reusable object-oriented software. So the Gang of Four did the same thing for object-oriented software. They said, okay, we're using all of these patterns that we're seeing all the time, and we don't have names for them. So let's call that one facade, let's call that one abstract factory, let's call that one, I don't know. There are, lots to choose from. And again, the object was to codify existing behavior. The problem with design patterns is that this is a good way to put it. Pablo Picasso says, good artists copy, great artists steal. When you apply design patterns without understanding in what situations they're appropriate, you end up with badness. Now, Picasso said this and didn't really explain what he meant. I think what he meant was that when you don't understand something, you mimic. You see that there is success and you mimic. You try and replicate the success by copying the behavior. However, when you understand why something is successful, then you don't mimic. You integrate the core ideas. You steal the core ideas. So you don't just copy, you're stealing somebody else's ideas. This is not an original thought of mine, but I'll claim it is. And the problem with design patterns is that you often, and with anyone who copies, is that you get things like cargo cults. Now, I don't know if people know what a cargo cult is here. In the Polynesian islands in the Second World War, the American army were using these small islands with small, secluded tribes that had never seen Westerners before, and they were using them as air bases. So they built airstrips, planes were landing, crates were unloading, and all of a sudden this island, which had been secluded thousands of kilometers from civilization for centuries, all of a sudden there was this massive wealth arrived with the war. The war was a boom time for these islands. And 1945 came, the war ended, the Americans left, and there were these tribes who, to try and replicate the behavior that they'd observed, the planes landing in the train, the crates getting off the planes, started to mimic the circumstances that they had seen. So they started building airport terminals. They started building aeroplanes out of straw and sticks, trying to create the circumstances that they had seen so that the planes would come back. And in design patterns, you've got the same kind of thing, so much so that you've got an anti-patterns catalog. It's a wiki documenting all of the ways that you can abuse anti-patterns. Some people have said that the Gang of Four have a lot to answer for in software development, because now design patterns are everywhere, and you get cases where sort of common design patterns are misused, so that if you want to add a new feature, you have to change every class in your project. So in some sense, community anti-patterns, the way I see community anti-patterns are, they're best practices. They're really good ideas, things that you want to see people doing, but applied perhaps in the wrong way, or taken to, dialed up to 9, taken to the nth degree, and maybe the results aren't those that were desired because we didn't really understand why the best practice was the best practice. So they're best practices run amok. So the first design pattern I'm going to introduce you to is the cookie licker. Now, to illustrate what a cookie licker is, I'm going to tell a story. We're in Dublin. The pub culture. So there's a joke. An Irishman is in a pub. He's having a pint, and he's dying to go to the toilet. But he doesn't want to leave his pint on the bar because he knows the bar he's in is a bit shifty. And he knows that if he comes back and he leaves a pint unattended, that the pint is not going to be there when he gets back. So he rips the back off a bar mat, whips out his pen and writes, "I spat in this," and props it up against the pint. Goes away, content in the knowledge that when he comes back, his pint will be there. And he arrives back and sees written underneath, "So did I." Now, a cookie licker, it's the child who sees the last cookie on the plate and says, "Ooh, I want to have that cookie, but I'm not hungry right now," takes the cookie off, licks it, puts it back on the plate, and says, "It's going to be there for me in an hour." Right? In a community sense, this is somebody who volunteers. The Apache community calls this volunteerism. Somebody who volunteers for tasks, even though they know, it's a really good idea, they know they're able to do it, but they also know they won't really have time. But they volunteer for the task anyway. So the symptoms are, and the problem with this anti-pattern is that it's often the best contributors to the community that you see doing this. The symptoms are that the community member volunteers for tasks. When asked for progress reports, it's, "Oh, I haven't had time this month. I'm going to get to that next week." Progress reports are infrequent and vague. And when it's suggested that somebody takes over, often the reaction is, "No, really, I really want to do this. I'm going to make time this week." Or, "I'm almost finished. I've got a draft in my inbox. It would be a waste. It would be a shame to waste all of the effort I've already put into this." So the person becomes a roadblock. They become a blockage to the thing getting done in the community. And there are the causes, the reasons why this happens are straightforward. The person wants to get things done well. They believe that they're the best person to do the job. And the best community members always overcommit. I mean, this is systemic in free software projects. The person truly believes that they can make time to do it. They truly believe that, it'll only take me a few hours between doing a presentation after work on Saturday and starting this project on Monday morning. Well, I have all day Sunday, I'll get it done. So they truly do believe that they can make time. And once they've committed to it, handing off that task to somebody else is an admission of failure by the person. They're saying, "Yes, I said I was going to do this, and I'm sorry, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I didn't get to do it." And that's, in some sense, it seems a failure. But there are ways to treat it. And the first one, the most important one, is to make failure okay. Make sure that it's okay for somebody to commit to something. And then when they say, "I'm sorry, I haven't had time," be very, very public about making that okay. Thank you for letting us know that you didn't have time. Now we can assign it to somebody else. Now we can find somebody else who's going to volunteer to do this. You've done the right thing. You set deadlines on tasks. You make sure that when a task is assigned to somebody, when somebody volunteers to do something, they say, "Okay, if this doesn't get done by the end of next month, it's up for grabs again." And you say that up front so that when you get to the deadline, it suddenly becomes okay to say, "I'm sorry, I haven't had time to work on this," and then it's up for discussion again. Second anti-pattern. When you've got a new contributor coming into your project, a newbie on the list, he's asking lots of questions. He really wants to get involved. Right? So he asks first, "What programming language is your project written?" And you answer that. And then he says, "Okay, where can I get the source code?" And you answer that. And then how can I build it? And you answer that question. And then he has a problem with the build process, so you have to install a dependency, and you answer that. And it keeps coming. It keeps coming over and over and over again. Question after question after question. You have a help vampire. This is somebody who needs to be spoon-fed, like the child that we saw in the previous picture. Somebody who needs to have their hand held through the entire process. And the problem with somebody like that is that they're consuming community resources. Every question they ask on a mailing list is demanding the attention of everybody else on the list. So, if untreated, this can really, really suck life out of your project. It's taking contributor time dealing with newcomers who haven't learnt how to help themselves. And that's really the treatment. The garlic here is to have good newbie docs. You make sure that when a newcomer comes to your project, that they know how to get started. And if somebody asks a question on a mailing list, then you can say, "Okay, here's the documentation for that. Here's how to look for that answer yourself. Teach somebody how to fish rather than giving them a fish." And encourage, and this is the most important thing, and this is something that some of the online forums have done particularly well. Java Ranch is a good example. You encourage newbies or recent newbies to answer newcomers' questions. So you leave your more experienced, your busier contributors often, are helping get stuff done, get code done. They're helping people who are just the next level down. And then the people who have that answer and often don't feel empowered to answer those questions. When you come into a community, it's intimidating. You see all of these people, these high-powered people who are answering all of these questions. You see not to pick on anyone in the Migo community, but you see Greg Crowe-Hartman, famous names, Arjen van Rijn, and people who are, big, important people in the free software world answering questions on, how to get an SDK installed or something like that. Well, those are questions that somebody else could answer. So the more experienced developers sometimes can leave space underneath and encourage newer developers who, perhaps I asked that question a month ago and I can answer it, but I'm not going to answer it because I know that somebody else is going to. So please do encourage recent newbies to answer new questions. There is the extreme anti-pattern of the help vampire is the RTFM anti-pattern. If you're insisting that everybody read every piece of documentation in your project before they ask a question, then that is just as bad as answering trivial questions all the time. Next anti-pattern, headless chicken. Speaks for itself in some sense. Most communities look like this. You've got a bunch of people trying to pull the community in one direction or another. And without leadership, what happens is that the ball in the middle doesn't move because he who pulls loudest stops any movement of the ball. There is always somebody who disagrees, right? So if you don't have some kind of direction, some kind of leadership, some kind of way that decisions get made, then oftentimes discussion will carry on and on and on and on and on and taper out, and you don't get a decision. You end up with bike shed discussions. Now, who here knows where the bike shed phrase comes from? Oh, a good spattering. So 1950s book on management by a guy called Parkinson. And he wrote Parkinson's Law, one of Parkinson's laws. He's got many. It's a very good book. One of Parkinson's laws is that the amount of discussion in committee on any budget line item will be inversely proportional to the size of the line item. And he gives the example of a nuclear factory, a nuclear power station in the 50s that's being built, and they're building a new reactor. And so they get a bid from an engineering company, and the engineering bid has been reviewed by the technical board, and it comes before the board of directors of the nuclear power station. And in 5 minutes, they've presented the bid, they've presented the review, and voted $10 million. Great. And then the next line item is $450, the bike shed outside. Right? People are going to be working in this nuclear reactor, and we have to build a bike shed. And now this is the opportunity that all of the board members have been waiting for, to help. Because they don't understand nuclear reactors, right? They're all politicians. But they all understand what goes into building a bike shed. So we should make it aluminium, or we should make it wood. This is too expensive. $450, how much is he spending on screws? And so this is your opportunity to make your mark. This is your opportunity to show that you have been paying attention. And in technical discussions, this would be the equivalent of, a decision on whether to use nanoseconds or microseconds as your core unit in the kernel or whatever. I think wasn't that in the BSD kernel, was whether we were going to use microseconds or milliseconds. And it's an insignificant decision in the greater scheme of things, but it results in this discussion that lasts 2 months, and at the end of the day, nobody understands. So the expression is, who cares what color the bike shed is painted? Let's just build the bike shed. Right? It's not important. So bike shed discussions are an example of what happens when you have a lack of leadership. And leadership is the core cure to this. And the problem is that you can't just grow leadership. Leaders are, and often in free software projects that have this problem, there are leaders there, but they are not affirming their leaderships. There are de facto leaders. There are people who people would follow, but they're not stepping up to the plate. And so that's often the question. That's often the solution to this, is to take aside the people who are the de facto leaders in that project and say, listen, you've got to put an end to this discussion. You are in a position to do it. Nobody else is. And often they don't realize that they would have that power. And I mean, in projects like GNOME, the leaders are often very unassuming and say, well, you know, there's no point in me coming out. I don't have any opinion on this. And that's exactly the point that you want to make. Yes, there's no point in having an opinion on this. The people who consider it important and are going to do it have made a very good proposal, and let's just put an end to the discussion. And the other thing you can do is to grow a culture of doing. Make sure that in your project you are valuing the doing of things rather than the talking about things. So one of the things I like to do when there's a bike shed discussion that comes up is to propose, if there are two conflicting visions of how the problem should be solved, to propose a bake-off. Right? You say, okay, you know, this is a task that would take maybe a couple of weeks. Let's get together in a month, review what's been done, right, and compare the two solutions and see which one is best. And at the end of the month, you know, the guy who made the initial proposal has gone on and he's done what he proposed, and the guys who are objecting typically have continued objecting and haven't actually done what they were proposing as the counter solution, and so you end up with a de facto winner from the bake-off. But even if you do go on to have two solutions and you get to evaluate at the end which one is better, that's a win-win situation. The next anti-pattern is the water cooler. Now, this is the first one which really affects more companies than individuals. Up until now, we've seen our projects. Up until now, we've seen anti-patterns which are essentially individual behavior gone wrong, or projects which are missing some kind of leadership element. The water cooler is really nefarious in free software projects. What do I mean by the water cooler? The water cooler pattern is the tendency for people who are working together within the same company to use the hallway, to use the coffee room, to use the water cooler as the place where they talk to each other, as the place where they get work done. When you have a difficult problem and you're banging your head off the wall for hours in front of your computer, you get up, you go to the water cooler, you chat to a colleague about it for 5 minutes, and you say, oh, great, I've got the solution, right? I understand what the problem was. And when it's at that level, that's fine. But what we've seen more and more in free software projects when you've got companies involved is that they say, well, no, it's like going to the mailing list. It's too hard. You know, every single decision we have to make, the most insignificant decisions, we've got to talk about them for 2 weeks on the mailing list. We've got to present this to the community. You know, it's just so much easier for me to go next door, work with the guy who's going to be working on it with me, and then come out and present something that we've done at the end. And really, this stems from a fear of community. Now, what do I mean by fear of community? It's not fear in the sense of, horror, right? But it's fear in the sense of, we do not believe that we can get as much work done as efficiently as we need to working in the open, working with a group of people where every single micro decision can get discussed and devolve into a bike shed discussion. And there are solutions to this. I mean, the first solution is to realize that you don't have to listen to people when you're working in the open. You can work in a glasshouse, and this is a recommendation that I make to anybody who has a design decision that they want some kind of design integrity. Okay, appoint your designer, appoint the development team that's going to work with the designer, and make sure they're working in a mailing list. All of the discussions are archived. People can subscribe to the mailing list and follow along with the discussions. But if you want to work in a glasshouse and not let people post to those discussions, then fine. Use a moderator, use convention, or just have the public archives and have people be able to follow along in public without actually being able to post. You can get work done in public, let people see what's happening without letting them participate in those decisions. It's not something I would recommend as a long-term solution, but if you want to get small work groups together to get something, as I said, where you need design integrity, then that's a perfectly fine thing to do. And people just want to understand why decisions get made and how those decisions get made. When things are happening in smoke-filled rooms and you hear about decisions, or the first time you hear about a feature is when you get a code dump of 5,000 lines, that's doing things the wrong way. Open design does not mean design by committee. And if there's one thing I want you guys to take away from here today, it's that you can work in the open and let people see what's happening without taking into account their viewpoint. Now, I would recommend long-term that you want to, at least consider what people do in reaction to what you're doing, but what people say in reaction to what you're doing. But you can get stuff done without taking people's viewpoint into account. Now, the next anti-pattern is the black hole. And I'm not talking about Google here. I'm not talking about companies who are hiring people away from your community. The black hole I'm talking about is a phenomenon that you will see where a community developer, very active on a mailing list, very active in terms of reviewing patches and so on, gets hired to work full-time on the project that he is a community developer for, and suddenly becomes less active on the mailing list, suddenly becomes less active in reviewing patches. Two quotes I like about this. One, Patrick Oley. I don't know if he's here this week. But on a mailing list about sync evolution, a few years ago, I guess, at this stage, he wrote, "Since I started working on sync evolution full-time at the beginning of this year, I've had less time than compared with previous years when I did it in my spare time. Less time for doing things like releases and patch review." I worked for a company called Wengo in France at one stage, and one of the developers, when I was doing interviews when I started to say, why are we not seeing developers participating on the mailing list? He said, "I'm too busy to spend time answering questions on the mailing list." His job, as far as he was concerned, was writing code. And his manager agreed with him. He was giving him lots and lots of work. And so reviewing patches and answering developer questions, recruiting, in some sense, other developers who were going to be lightening his load later on, wasn't part of his job as far as he was concerned. So there are treatments for this. The treatment is to ensure that doing things in the open is part of the job description. Make sure that managers and engineers in community development have some kind of training, if it's on-the-job training, if it's working with people who are more experienced or whatever, mentoring, but make sure that they're getting some kind of training in community development. It is a different way of working. There are different needs. There are different expectations in terms of the amount of time that you will be spending doing different tasks. When you're a full-time professional developer, you can expect to spend 80 to 90% of your time actually coding and the rest of your time in meetings. As a community developer, you're in meetings in some sense all the time, because you're always on the mailing list, you're always collaborating with people on a public source control system. You've got to make sure that that's part of their job. And this is really one of the most difficult things to do, because a lot of the time the middle management, the managers who are managing those developers, some of them have quite a lot of free software experience, and the managers really don't. And so that's the level where you got to ensure that people get that expectation that you will be spending 30 to 40% of your time not coding, but doing community outreach, communication, patch review, whatever, right? Making sure that people know what you're working on. And this is going back to something that the ISV developer who was sitting there earlier asked. One of the things which I really like is to document who's doing what publicly and explicitly document some things that you would like to see done, but nobody in your company is working on. So the public roadmap is a very good way to address this anti-pattern. So one of the things we did in Wengo, for example, is we said, okay, these are the 10 features we would like to see in the next release. We're going to work on these 6. These 4 here, we don't have the resources to work on them, but if somebody does a patch, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to participate. You're providing a hook. If somebody does a patch for those and they meet our patch review standards, then it's going in. So you're not going to be standing on somebody's toes. One of the things which is the worst phenomenon that you can see in a free software project is you see somebody who's been working on something for 3 weeks. They say, okay, I'm really interested in a feature in particular. I can't think of one specifically. I'm really interested in this feature. I'm going to start working on it. You spend evenings, you spend weekends, you work on it for 3 weeks, part-time. You've got something nearly ready to go, and then you post a question to a mailing list saying, I've got some kind of a design decision here, and somebody writes back and say, oh, I've been working on that for a month, it's finished. Right? Whoop, here's the code. And that's the first you hear of it. So avoid the black hole, because that's the cost of that. If people are working without communicating all the time, without letting people know what they're working on, and, as he said, what they're not working on, then you will see duplication of effort. And if you start to see duplication of effort, you will very quickly see that duplication of effort stop, because the community developers will just go away. Right? And only the commercial developers will be working on features, because they're the ones who know what everybody is doing. Okay, we're into behavioral patterns here. So the broken window. In 1980s in New York, crime rates were high, and I know somebody is going to mention Freakonomics here. There is some discussion about this, but the mayor of New York in the 1980s brought in a zero-tolerance policy. He said, we will crack down on minor crime, because by cracking down on minor crime, people will see that we're keeping order in the city, and all of those major crimes will also go down in consequence. The broken window phenomenon is people who would otherwise not be engaging in illegal behavior see this big pane of glass. They see half of the windows broken. It's that much easier to pick up a stone and throw it through it. So broken window phenomena that you see in communities are things like off-topic or bike shed threads in a mailing list, or an IRC channel which was useful, degrading into meaningless chatter all the time, so no work gets done. All of your best contributors go off and find another channel that they create and try and get some work done. Wiki vandalism, or editing standards in wikis, or naming conventions in wikis kind of continually degrade to the point where the wiki becomes unmaintainable. And so when you start to see small examples of things which you'd like not to see in your community, it's very hard sometimes to stop that snowball from rolling up and gathering momentum. So the treatment for this kind of anti-pattern is first to document your best practices. Make sure that there are documents for that. I know that Dawn has been collecting, I see you, has been collecting the documents of best practices for mailing list participation, for editing documents in the wiki, and so on. You remind offenders early. You make sure that there are constant but gentle reminders that there are guidelines, that the current behavior that you're observing is not in line with those guidelines, and spread the policing load around. This is vital. Because what happens is, if you have one person who is always the person who is telling people not to top post, or telling people that they're creating names creating pages in the wiki with bad names, or whatever, what you get is the broken record anti-pattern. And this is one person who's always doing the same thing. And he becomes kind of like the Michael Douglas character in Falling Down. Anybody know this film from the 90s? Yeah, you're in your late 30s as well. Michael Douglas's character here in this film. He starts off, he's having a really bad day, he's stuck in traffic, he gets out of the car, he abandons it. He gets ripped off, or he stops a store owner from ripping him off. Then he's walking through gangland in LA and gets attacked by a Latino gang, and he, cracks the head open of one of them with a baseball bat and steals their bag of guns. And then he goes along and he stops a surplus store neo-Nazi racist from killing somebody or whatever by shooting him. And then he kind of goes on a rampage, and it kind of progresses, right? And at the end, he's trying to visit his daughter for the birthday, is the thing, right? So he's going across the city to visit his daughter and railing against all of these ills of modern society. And at the end, he's confronted by the policeman, the Robert Duvall figure in the film, and he says, "Who are all these people?" And Robert Duvall says, "These are the good guys. Put down your gun. Don't do anything silly. These are the good guys." And he says, "You mean I'm the bad guy? How did that happen? I did everything they told me to. I did everything I was supposed to." And sometimes you can feel like that as a community manager, community leader in a project. Is if you're always the guy who's, railing against this, what you see as bad behavior, you become the problem at some stage. And often, the treatment for this is really simple. It's don't be that guy. And often, as a community manager, community leader type figure, the treatment here is simple. It's just, all you need is a gentle reminder, look, you've been talking about GPL violation. It's gone beyond productive, right? You are now becoming a problem because you're entrenching people in their positions, so you're not going to get any progress or whatever. And a gentle reminder is usually enough for the person to say, oh, really? Oh, wow. I didn't mean to become the problem here or to become noise. And, tone it down. But spread the load around because, nobody likes to be the guy who's complaining all the time, right? So I'm going to leave you with a final thought. Communities are essentially emotional places. Communities are about people interacting with each other on a human level, more so than on a technical level. And you get to decide what your communities are like. They can be like this. They can be frustrating places to be. They can be places where you're always hitting your head off a wall trying to get stuff done. They can be like this. They can be a kind of a place where you try to get everybody to align and have a kind of a Borg-like single vision, right? And anything that's taking you away from that vision, you say, well, this is how we are, right? And you talk in the collective all the time, Or you can make your communities places that are fun to be in. You can make your communities places where people like to share, right? This is free software is all about sharing. It's all about having fun together and producing something that is really amazing. So that is the community goal that I want to leave you with. Let's create a fun and friendly environment where people feel safe, sharing great work, and making a great mobile platform. Thank you. So are there any questions? There are some microphones, so we're going to try and get people to use the microphones. I'll actually run around with microphones if anybody wants to see that happen. Are there any questions? Okay, then thank you very much. We'll go to break. Or am I? Oh, sorry.
How would you encourage leaders to step up to their role and to spread the load so that one person doesn't become the broken record?
So the spreading the load is often it's the one person. The one person will look for people to help. I know that you don't like this either. I know that you don't like this either. Help me out here. Don't leave me hanging all the time, right? Or maybe the person who's always insisting on don't top post. Maybe the solution is to say, okay, look, we don't really care about top posting anymore. Times have changed, and top posting and threading discussions properly and properly cutting discussions was important a while ago, and now we all have massive amounts of disk space, and maybe we don't care about that so much anymore. So it's all about evolving standards to make sure that people are. And I guess it's once you've got well-documented standards, it's easier to avoid the broken record syndrome because people will just point to those documents of guidelines. About getting leaders to stand up, that's a trickier one. And I mean, a lot of these anti-patterns, the solutions are not straightforward. Nothing is easy here.
I have a suggestion there.
Yeah?
A lot of the time, I think people just need to be told that they can, that it's okay to step up, because there's a fair number of people in programming that are pretty shy, or they think that it's not their place to do that. If you tell them it's okay to, tell people what our standards are, so long as they're not being a jerk about it, then I think they will start to do that. You just got to give them a bit of encouragement and a little push here and there.
But then you also, as an individual, need to feel empowered to say, look, this is a bike shed discussion, and you're a good person to stop it. And so if as an individual you feel empowered to say, okay, I really think that his opinion is the one that matters, and I need to get him to pipe in on this, then go talk to the guy. It's human relationships. Yes, down the back.
We have lots of managers here, and you recommended them and engineers to participate in community development trainings.
Right.
Any good to recommend, or a book
on
the topic on community development?
Is there any? I'm sorry, I missed
that
the
you
word.
would be recommending to the managers and engineers?
Any
here?
books that I would recommend?
Or community development trainings?
So, not meaning to sell my own services here.
yeah, definitely that one. But anything else?
As Neary Consulting, I do work with professional developers on working better with free software community. So there you go. In terms of books, resources, there are a few that I would mention. The first, Peopleware, is a good one for general team management, team building, getting people to have small successes together. But the big step is thinking of your team as being beyond the walls, right? The canonical reference in free software here is Carl Fogel's book called Producing Open Source Software. It's free, it's online. And it really is a Bible. It's one that you should definitely read. Anybody here who hasn't read it, who is managing developers working in free software projects, you need to you need to read it yourself and get your developers to read it. John O'Bacon, The Art of Community, came out last year, the year before. It's a pretty good reference as well. Producing Open Source Software is the one that I would recommend you read first.
Okay.
So there you go. That's 2 book references, 3 book references. Plus, yeah, come and see me later if you are interested in getting a training seminar going. Is that okay, selling one's services online here? Oh yeah, that's. Oh yeah, you did that all yesterday morning, didn't you? So thank you very much, and enjoy your coffee break.